The vessel docked in Fort Pierce was Brian and Lynette Hooker's isolated home for years. When federal investigators step onto an isolated scene wearing blue nitrile gloves, securing items in brown evidence envelopes, locking down the chain of custody, and setting up a processing table, we know psychologically they are no longer chasing vague theories. They already found something real. If the psychology of this case grips you, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on notifications to follow every real-time update of this behavioral investigation. That is exactly where the Lynette Hooker true crime investigation stands right now. Following the Coast Guard's seizure of the SOULMATE on May 9, 2026, a critical turning point confirmed to Fox News Digital and CBS News by sources deeply involved in the case. Those sources verified the vessel was actively sailing toward the United States when intercepted. Coast Guard investigative agents have already physically boarded the vessel to begin a highly exhaustive forensic and psychological evaluation. Observers on the ground in Fort Pierce report that police tape already surrounds the SOULMATE over at the local Coast Guard station. Investigators were observed carefully extracting physical items from the boat inside sealed evidence bags. They set up a processing table on the dock to methodically catalogue every behavioral fragment pulled from the deck. Let's pause here. You and I need to understand what that perimeter of police tape truly represents from an expert behavioral standpoint. It is not a simple protocol, nor is it an administrative precaution applied out of sheer caution. Securing a physical environment with tape legally declares that a profound trauma occurred there, carrying permanent psychological and severe criminal consequences. They establish a strict psychological perimeter where every human trace is analyzed and preserved under the rigorous standards demanded by criminal courts. They lock down the chain of custody from clinical collection through every psychological and legal stage of a potential criminal trial. They are cementing the evidentiary foundation upon which the entire psychological profile of the case will rest. The SOULMATE is now officially and legally a crime scene. This reality has been validated by multiple independent public sources. Investigative sources confirmed the boat's seizure, while independent media outlets reported its capture just as it was sailing toward United States territory. Prism News noted this action mentally shifts the case from a simple search toward meticulously preserving vital evidence for a criminal inquiry. Brian Hooker has not been formally charged with any crime. His defense attorney over in Michigan, his legal defense publicly asked that he receive the benefit of the doubt and be treated with the exact same human empathy as anyone else. He has consistently denied any responsibility. As professionals, we will respect that presumption of innocence during every psychological detail we analyze. But forensic evidence in Fort Pierce speaks for itself. You and I will examine every behavioral detail step by step. Before profiling exactly what these agents seek aboard that vessel, we must clarify one aspect that has generated profound cognitive confusion in media coverage. Multiple commentators and media outlets have mistakenly labeled the FBI as the leading agency handling this highly complex investigation. That assumption is completely factually inaccurate. The Coast Guard Investigative Service is actually leading this, not the FBI, not the state police, and certainly not the authorities in the Bahamas. According to internal case documentation reviewed by reporters early on, individuals who accessed early internal files confirm these agents are federal law enforcement investigating violations of United States laws in strict behavioral alignment with the Justice Department. Their specific legal jurisdiction covers criminal acts affecting United States citizens and vessels, flying the national flag across maritime environments heavily encompassing both international and foreign waters. But what no manual captures is their psychological profile. These agents operate as absolute maritime specialists. They read isolated boats exactly the way FBI behavioral profilers read a bloody room. They grasp precisely how electrical systems record human routines and data. They understand exactly where navigation logs hide. They know perfectly what a battery system tracks and how to mentally decode its underlying human behavior. They identify how satellite communications create psychological connection logs, locating exactly where that digital memory hides long after the session ends. They never force land-based forensic protocols onto an unfamiliar ecosystem defined by deep psychological tension and isolation. They operate mentally and physically within the precise, high-stress environment for which they were conditioned and trained. Looking at the behavioral analysis from forensic scientist Joseph Scott Morgan, who spoke to the media regarding the profound scope of this investigation. These agents have full government backing and can readily request behavioral support from the FBI, as detailed by that highly specialized source. Morgan noted they hunt for massive concentrations of blood or dried plasma, but they are ultimately evaluating human behavior, tracking any desperate guilt-driven attempt to clean or sanitize that scene. That is the strict psychological and forensic baseline we apply to the SOULMATE today. However, there is one point that demands a direct, unflinching behavioral evaluation. Forensic experts note that analyzing the scene now is hardly ideal. The vessel was seized a full month after the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. He warned that as time passes, all biological evidence severely degrades and becomes physically compromised. And that creates issues. It is a completely valid concern coming from an accredited forensic specialist. Biological traces expire. Heat accelerates their decay. More than 5 agonizing weeks have passed since that dark night on April 4th. The captain and the first mate were aboard during the entire crossing. Other subjects could have accessed the boat while moored in Marsh Harbor, but there is a behavioral and physical element that eliminates this doubt. The most critical evidence on the SOULMATE is not biological, it is purely electronic. Electronic memory does not suffer biological decay. Records are not erased by the heat. Digital timestamps never simply fade away. GPS history does not rot over 5 weeks. That is why investigators are focusing their analysis on the vessel's electronic data. Let's examine each evidence category closely. There is a crucial behavioral aspect that traditional true crime coverage has entirely overlooked here. Because until very recently, those following the investigation had no idea the SOULMATE had onboard cameras. And it definitely does. According to direct sources corroborated by visual and photographic records of the vessel, there appears to be a security camera system installed right under the bimini. For those unfamiliar with nautical terms, the bimini is the canvas canopy structure shading the cockpit of a sailboat. It is the shaded outdoor area where people spend most of their time socially interacting on deck. It is where you sit for an evening drink. It is the exact entry point when you climb aboard from the dinghy. It is the very first physical space your body occupies when stepping onto your vessel. A security camera placed there has a direct visual line to the entire helm area, the hatch leading down to the cabins, and any subject boarding or attempting to cross the deck inside. This piece of evidence could prove to be the most decisive of the entire investigation. Brian Hooker's personal account of the night of April 4th requires that the SOULMATE remained completely empty from the moment he and Lynette left in the dinghy around 7:30 until the Hopetown rescue brought him back on the morning of April 5th. That is the narrative he delivered to the Bahamian authorities. The exact same narrative he repeated on the recorded call with Blaine Stevenson last April 7th. A conversation he had no idea was actually being recorded. That is the story he offered publicly to the media after his release. If his statement is truthful, the bimini camera should not register any activity after his departure. No movements, no people, zero activity. Just a dark, empty cabin. That is what the footage would show if Brian is telling the truth. But if Brian and Lynette returned to the SOULMATE, if the dinghy anchored and they boarded, if they were actually there the night of April 4th, that lens captured their behavior. And this is the psychological trigger that transforms something important into something absolutely decisive. We must remember modern surveillance systems on liveaboard boats serve one clear primary psychological function: security. When owners are absent, they typically send recordings to the cloud automatically and constantly. This means that even if the subject deleted local videos to hide his actions, even if someone destroyed the physical camera in a sheer panic attack, the digital footprint survives remotely. A server the CGIS accesses by federal order, a silent archive that recorded everything on the boat the night Lynette Hooker vanished. Let's pose a concrete scenario together. What would the footage reveal if 2 subjects boarded the SOULMATE after 7:45 p.m.? Contrasting that discovery against every element of the narrative Brian Hooker gave authorities since April 5th would be psychologically devastating. Imagine how a jury's brain would process those images. It would not simply question his story. It would completely destroy it. We still ignore what that camera captured, but the CGIS is working relentlessly to uncover it right now in Fort Pierce. That is the element transforming the surveillance system into potentially decisive behavioral evidence. A technical pattern that much of the press has failed to interpret or explain to the true crime audience following the case. Modern sailboats, especially those with complex solar power systems, like the one the SOULMATE itself carried, they rely on battery management systems to store and route power throughout the entire vessel. These aren't mere batteries. They are complex systems tracking our behavioral footprint, monitoring every surge in electricity, constantly logging the vessel's charge. And in modern setups, they archive every single electrical event with absolute uncompromising chronological precision. Every action is time-stamped with an accuracy human memory simply cannot match. When someone flicks a switch, the log records that sudden need for light, the exact hour, the duration, the energy consumed. When a subject triggers the water pump to wash the salt from their skin, the system captures the impulse. Opening the fridge leaves a mark. If someone craves the psychological comfort of a hot shower, the heater kicking on records that exact desire. When our modern anxiety to charge a device pulls current, the system quietly observes it. According to those intimate with Lynette's strict behavioral routines aboard the catamaran SOULMATE. Back in February 2026, Lynette showed an almost obsessive pattern upon returning, heading straight down to wash off the ocean's salt. Boarding, descending, showering, decompressing. It was her psychological anchor, a rigid, unbreakable human routine. If Lynette actually stepped aboard the SOULMATE on that fatal night of April 4th, you and I need to be clinical here. We are examining a behavioral hypothesis that investigators are weighing not proven fact. Since Brian maintains his total innocence, the digital log should cleanly reflect the electrical signature of two human subjects retreating to their sanctuary after a long day. Cabin lights clicking on. Water pumps running, water heaters activating, phones charging. It is the unmistakable psychological pattern of domestic life resuming aboard a vessel after an absence. According to forensics experts consulted during this deeply complex criminal investigation, Brian and Lynette had swapped the SOULMATE's grid for a highly modern unit a couple of years back. Clinically speaking, this detail is vital. Newer systems maintain an exhaustive digital memory. We are far past the era of primitive energy cells. They constantly generate data, forging a time-stamped history of every single human action, draining their power. In both psychological and forensic terms, they act as intimate digital diaries. There are only two potential realities this log might reveal. The first, behavioral scenario. The log reveals absolutely no anomalies past 4:15 p.m. on April 4th when they supposedly departed. Just automatic background systems, the fridge, the bilge pump, latent mechanical processes, utterly devoid of human presence. That data would fully validate Brian's narrative, proving the SOULMATE sat completely dark and empty from mid-afternoon until the following morning. The second, behavioral scenario. The machine exposes a very clear pattern of living human activity long after 7:45 p.m. Lights, hot water, active chargers. The undeniable behavioral signature of two people inhabiting their space with absolute normality after returning home. Let's weigh what that means together. That reality would psychologically shatter every word Brian Hooker told authorities about the night of April 4th. To the rescue teams, the federal investigators, and every national news outlet where he has performed this mask of calm since leaving the Bahamas. Cognitive dissonance cannot save him here. The digital log either confirms his story or utterly destroys it. This cold machine feels absolutely zero guilt. It cannot be gaslit or emotionally manipulated. You cannot convince a battery it is lying. It merely recorded human energy impulses and their exact timing. The CGIS currently holds that hardware and its memory. When the forensic analysis concludes, the data will inexorably reveal the true psyche of that night. Not as a psychological hallucination, but as irrefutable fact. This third category of digital evidence demands our shared attention. If Brian understands his own technology, this is the psychological thread that should terrify him the most. The SOULMATE featured a Starlink satellite antenna deliberately mounted high upon the mast to maximize its psychological sphere of influence and physical range. Starlink operates as a powerful broadband network, providing high-speed internet, essentially warding off the psychological dread of total isolation even in remote areas devoid of traditional cellular coverage. It was the vital digital umbilical cord that kept Brian and Lynette mentally tethered to society during 4 years of continuous sailing. It was the primary channel Lynette used to project her identity outward. It kept their minds anchored to reality while physically drifting around the Abaco Islands. According to sources intimately familiar with the vessel's technical anatomy, that mast-mounted Starlink terminal cast a very wide net, meaning any human desperately clutching a smartphone would automatically reconnect long before they ever touched the fiberglass hull. If Brian and Lynette truly approached their catamaran in that dinghy on the dark night of April 4th, their devices would have desperately hunted for that familiar Wi-Fi network the very second they crossed into its radius. Both devices were undeniably alive that night. This fact remains heavily documented through digital communications intercepted during the criminal probe. Furthermore, both individuals wore Apple Watches directly tethered to their own physical biology. The precise moment those devices pinged the Soulmate's network was permanently encoded into its digital memory. Let's look at this together. Here lies the behavioral detail that makes this evidence so crucial. Starlink doesn't store logs on the vessel. It files them in remote servers and external cloud infrastructure operated entirely by SpaceX. Those servers document every single connection event across their global network, and federal investigators can access them using a strict subpoena from the Department of Justice. This means that even if Brian compulsively wiped down every phone, every single tablet, and every local hard drive hidden on the Soulmate, even if a panic attack drove him to destroy the devices, Starlink's flawless memory of those connection logs, detailing exactly what linked to the Soulmate, at what specific time, and for how long, remains completely intact at SpaceX, just waiting to be analyzed. According to a maritime law professor who evaluated this exact case for specialized media, United States authorities, including the Coast Guard, have total jurisdiction to arrest him if behavioral and physical evidence align. Even though it happened in Bahamian waters, the vessel flies an American flag. That specific legal authority directly extends to judicial subpoenas served on American cloud infrastructure companies. Starlink is fully operated by SpaceX, a United States company. A federal subpoena delivered to SpaceX is totally enforceable. If those specific logs show his personal devices connected to the Soulmate after 7:30 on the evening of April 4th, flatly contradicting Brian's conscious narrative that digital footprints simply cannot be psychologically justified in any way. It is an objective, totally unalterable record. It has timestamps. It suffers no memory bias and doesn't cling to fabricated narratives. It simply exposes the cold, raw reality of every connection. We must still answer the core question driving this psychological investigation. Processing the Soulmate's digital evidence reveals the behavioral dynamics on that boat, but it alone does not tell us where Lynette actually is. What do you and I think investigators will uncover on the Soulmate? Will the electronic evidence validate Brian Hooker's conscious narrative or entirely shatter his psychological profile? Share your analysis below. And finding Lynette, returning her to her mother and daughter to begin healing that immense trauma is what true justice truly demands here. The Sea of Abaco has given back absolutely nothing. According to local fishermen, divers, and marine professionals who understand these waters, the Sea of Abaco is roughly 15 feet at its absolute deepest. The waters are completely crystal clear. According to fishermen, divers, and marine professionals who know those exact waters, the Sea of Abaco is only about 15 feet at its deepest point. Not a single garment, not that bright green bag, nor any personal effects. Behaviorally speaking, locals know the Sea of Abaco always returns its victims. That is exactly what the local experts, the fishermen, and the divers all maintain. If Lynette fell in under the exact circumstances dictated by Brian's conscious narrative, something physical should have definitely surfaced by now. Nothing has. If Lynette's remains are not in the water, they must be concealed elsewhere. Identifying that alternative location has now evolved into a parallel, highly focused psychological and geographic investigation. An investigation driven entirely by community volunteers conducting boots-on-the-ground searches, intensely scrutinizing the highly complex physical topography of the Abacos. Let's analyze the geography of these specific search areas together with precision. First is Tahiti Beach and the Atlantic coastline east of Elbow Cay. It is a significantly more isolated environment than the western side. Fewer tourists accessible by dinghy from Aunt Pat's Bay in just 10 minutes at low speed. Brian and Lynette spent that afternoon of April 4th right there. They knew that coastline. They had been there that very day. Psychologically speaking, when gripped by darkness or panic, the human brain instinctively retreats to familiar locations. The second spot is a dense mangrove zone at the northern tip of Elbow Cay, just before entering the main harbour of Hopetown. Mangroves present a very particular forensic challenge and opportunity. Due to their root structures, human remains typically get trapped well below the waterline. But specialized cadaver dogs, according to forensic experts we consulted during this psychological investigation, can easily detect the organic oils released by decomposition as they rise to the surface from up to 30 feet away. That specific sensory range makes the mangroves trackable completely unlike the open ocean. The third area is Snapper Point Marina, the eerie ruins of a resort complex utterly devastated by Hurricane Dorian back in 2019. Brian and Lynette knew this location well. They visited it with Carly in February 2026, actively documenting it on social media. It is easily accessible by water from Aunt Pat's Bay. A volunteer who thoroughly documented the terrain checked Snapper Point during earlier stages of the search, failing to uncover any conclusive behavioral or physical evidence. The hard coral and limestone soil of the Abacos makes any deep panic-driven concealment incredibly difficult. The fourth zone, and the one currently receiving the most obsessive attention from search volunteers, is the western coastline of Lubbers Quarters. Lubbers Quarters is a small private cay situated directly between Elbow Cay and Marsh Harbour, the exact geographical epicenter where this entire behavioral investigation has unraveled. Let's analyze this closely. The western shore turns away from Elbow Cay, completely shielded from the wind. That means it would have offered a perfect isolating refuge on the night of April 4th. A boat could silently reach those beaches in darkness, completely avoiding the extreme weather that Brian claims triggered his profound psychological collapse on the opposite side of the island. The western shore of Lubbers Quarters is totally free from the gaze of tourists. It provides deep psychological isolation. And according to investigative case files, Brian and Lynette likely explored those very beaches well before April 4th. A local Lubbers Quarters resident. A man named Dean, facing Elbow Cay, holds critical security footage. His cameras kept an unblinking objective gaze on the SOULMATE yacht's position throughout the dark night of April 4th. You and I know this footage is vital. Analysts are studying it to psychologically reconstruct the behavioral timeline at that anchorage after 7:45 p.m. The images Nathan gathered there reveal a stark, highly rugged and clearly rocky terrain. Jagged limestone sitting dangerously close to the very surface. This explains the cognitive frustration of the burial site. Digging deep here, without striking solid rock, is practically impossible. Small sand patches exist only in isolated spots above the tide line. And the lead volunteer tracker has firmly confirmed that the physical search continues. These specific zones of interest will be scoured again soon. But we must remain clinically precise about what behavioral analysis actually suggests and what it simply does not. I am not claiming that Lynette Hooker's remains are hidden in those locations. Furthermore, Brian Hooker has not been formally charged with any actual crime yet. We profile these zones because their exact geography perfectly matches the specific locations accessible from Aunt Pat's Bay during those dark hours of April 4th. We know Brian and Lynette possessed prior cognitive mapping of these specific locations, and simply because they offer the perfect psychological isolation to remain hidden weeks after her mysterious disappearance. Exhaustively tracking this is the only rational behavioral path. I promise to address the growing collective anxiety that prominent criminologists are currently expressing. You and I must objectively examine which factors favor the forensic investigators and which variables are actively working against them. Specialized sources have been incredibly direct about this daunting investigative challenge. Investigators are confronting a psychological and physical scenario far from ideal. They warned about the profound anxiety of not knowing exactly who boarded SOULMATE during its weeks in Marsh Harbour. They warned how biological evidence naturally decays over time. This ongoing degradation represents a massively serious stress factor for the entire true crime investigation. That is the cold, objective truth. I won't minimize its psychological impact. Critical biological evidence, blood, DNA, and physical traces all degrade rapidly under intense heat. An abandoned vessel in the Bahamas throughout April and May endures exactly the kind of hot, humid climate that aggressively accelerates physical and chemical destruction. 6 long weeks have dragged on since the trauma of April 4th. The captain and his first mate remained aboard for that entire psychological journey. The window to collect pristine biological evidence has firmly closed. That is our harsh reality. But let's rationally analyze one crucial factor compensating for this. Luminol. Forensic technicians utilize this specific chemical to uncover blood traces scrubbed by a panicked mind, revealing hidden trauma far beyond normal human visual perception. Chemically, it reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, triggering a glowing, visible reaction under harsh ultraviolet light. Surfaces that were compulsively scrubbed, bleached or obsessively washed can still expose profound blood traces beneath the luminol. On fiberglass, the foundational material of a yacht-like SOULMATE luminol will vividly expose biological evidence weeks or even months after the initial traumatic event. If blood spilled there and a guilty psyche frantically tried cleaning it, luminol reveals those dark secrets. Conversely, the electronic evidence I previously profiled in detail. The raw battery data logs. Starlink connection, histories on SpaceX servers or cloud storage recordings, this perfect digital memory simply never deteriorates like fragile human biological matter does. A harsh timestamp on a battery doesn't magically erase after 5 weeks. A solid server log will not psychologically or physically decompose under Florida heat. Those virtual recordings absolutely do not evaporate. SOULMATE's digital footprints either exist entirely or they don't. And if they do, the 6 agonizing weeks since April 4th remain completely irrelevant to their absolute evidentiary value. And then consider Lynette's intimate personal belongings. An aquamarine swimsuit cover-up doesn't mysteriously disintegrate in 5 weeks. A blue Controblix scarf doesn't just vanish by itself from the claustrophobia of a cabin. An Apple Watch resting on its charging cable doesn't just vanish through some psychological illusion. If those clothes remain inside SOULMATE, the exact items she was photographed wearing at Abaco Inn that afternoon, which Brian claims fell overboard, forensic analysts will certainly uncover them. We won't even need complex laboratories or psychological profiling. You and I need to look at this cognitively. Her being on that yacht, when Brian's narrative demands they were underwater, is a devastating psychological fracture. The biological clock Morgan detailed is an absolute reality, yet the most definitive psychological evidence in this dark investigation might just be what remains frozen in time. According to reports, on May 11th, right after the vessel docked in Fort Pierce, Carly Ellsworth posted a video expressing the profound grief of her very first Mother's Day without her mum. The psychological weight of that testimony is deeply profound. Carly verbalized the severe emotional toll of knowing she can no longer reach her mother, noting that her birthday week triggered an especially intense trauma response. That specific week coincided directly with Mother's Day in 2026. She navigated that milestone processing ambiguous loss entirely without her mother lacking any real closure. Clinically speaking, she endured this without updates on the forensic analysis seeking answers about the woman who raised her. She only knew the ship had already departed the Bahamas. She was completely blind to morbid details. This unresolved mystery maintains the strict silence typical of active federal criminal files. It is a legally sound and entirely necessary operational protocol. But psychologically, it forces Lynette's loved ones to endure a quiet, agonizing trauma while federal agents meticulously process bags of evidence down in Florida. Based on official logs, Brian Hooker's counsel refused to address the vessel's seizure, whether his client was cooperating or if his behavioral patterns remain under active investigative scrutiny. That is a standard legal prerogative. Attorneys always advise subjects to maintain total silence and deflect questions. It is standard defensive behavior. Yet Brian Hooker's absolute silence directed toward Lynette's own family. Not toward investigators or media, but his own family reveals a severe emotional detachment that Carly exposed, carrying immense diagnostic weight here. Transcripts show Brian compulsively repeating that he would never hurt Lynette, insisting his singular desire was to bring her back safely. He even claimed they had never spent this much time apart. On April 14th, Brian publicly declared his sole focus was finding his wife regardless of the physical or emotional toll. He stated he would never leave the Bahamas without her swearing nothing would stop his search. Yet just hours after projecting that performative facade for cameras, he was flying back home. Since then, his psychological profile displays textbook avoidance. He has failed to initiate any meaningful contact with Lynette's grieving daughter or mother. He hasn't called Carly. Clinically speaking, he hasn't adopted the desperate persona of a husband demanding authorities locate and return his missing spouse. This alarming flat effect is not criminal evidence. Brian remains uncharged. His defense team maintains his innocence, yet his extreme passive behavior is well documented. It is exactly the human behavioral pattern that we profilers analyze that taints a jury and that Lynette's family agonizingly endures every single morning. Carly posts heartbreaking birthday videos and digital messages forced to process her trauma completely devoid of answers. This behavioral pattern speaks volumes. Let's examine the current state of this investigation together, relying strictly on verified public reports. The vessel sits at the Florida coastal station, now officially designated as an active crime scene. Specialists are conducting a meticulous forensic analysis that will span multiple sessions over several agonizing days. They have extracted physical evidence in sealed bags. The intense scrutiny over camera networks, electrical logs, digital internet connections, and the central navigation system, along with communication equipment and biological traces left aboard the ship, is fully underway. The Coast Guard refuses to comment on investigative specifics due to the highly active status. Brian's defense team declined to discuss the boat's seizure or assess their client's current cooperation level. According to internal investigative sources, detectives are relentlessly interviewing potential witnesses while behavioral profiling and field inquiries rapidly escalate. The life raft, the psychological anchor of the narrative Brian constructed about that April night, remains in Bahamian custody. It must be transferred for forensic evaluation immediately. It is a critical piece of evidence whose surfaces, latches, anchoring system, and interior space have yet to undergo an exhaustive forensic assessment to uncover reality. And that has to change. The surveillance video remains locked under Bahamian jurisdiction. There is still no public confirmation regarding whether federal behavioral profilers have even evaluated this visual data. If they haven't seen it, this critical evidence needs to reach the investigative team without delay. Those recordings hold vital behavioral answers about movements and timelines that no other evidence can provide. The land search survives. As you and I watch closely, Nathan's sweep along the western coast continues and will resume very soon. Let's look at these images together. They hold behavioral answers about timing and movement that no other evidence can provide. On Mother's Day, reports noted Carly expressing how her deeply traumatized family remained completely in the dark regarding the investigation. The forensic exam of the SOULMATE will reveal crucial physical and behavioral footprints. These findings will either support the psychological narrative Brian Hooker built for April 4th or completely shatter his alibi. This moment permanently shifts the investigation's psychological profile. Brian Hooker faces no charges yet, and his defense team is carefully projecting an outward behavior of total innocence. The criminal probe accelerates. Lynette Hooker has been missing for 38 days, an agonizing, unresolved trauma. The current behavioral picture looks like this. Agents are inside the SOULMATE, analyzing the cordoned crime scene down in Fort Pierce. The evidence literal capsules of human behavior was meticulously sealed and logged right at the dock. The most exhaustive psychological and forensic analysis has begun on the central physical element of Lynette Hooker's tragic, mysterious disappearance. They are examining a security camera system under the awning. These are visual witnesses lacking cognitive bias with recordings that might exist beyond the physical device. This digital memory in the cloud, accessible by federal subpoena, would document if someone with dark psychological intent boarded the SOULMATE on the night of April 4th. A battery system logged every electrical event with exact timestamps, revealing hidden behavioral patterns, essentially creating a behavioral diary. It confirms whether the SOULMATE stayed dark and empty all night, or definitively shatters that denial. The Starlink satellite system keeps records that live off the boat safely stored on servers, owned by SpaceX. Federal agents can access them no matter how the physical onboard devices were destroyed, showing every device connected to the network and its interaction times. They also trace biological surfaces across the hull cabin, bathrooms, and kitchen. These are stages where luminol and advanced methods can read past physical trauma. Even weeks later, they also analyzed Lynette's intimate belongings, her aquamarine sarong and the royal blue contrablic scarf, and her Apple Watch. These objects trigger profound cognitive dissonance. They simply should not be there if Brian's story is true. According to forensic experts used to profiling such cases, investigators now have the full institutional weight of the government available. They can demand FBI support and send materials to the Quantico lab to unravel the behavioral truth. Every available resource designed to pressure the criminal mind and solve this dark investigation is right now held by agents sweeping the SOULMATE. According to maritime law experts consulted by specialized media, these agents possess full authority to arrest whoever crossed that moral boundary, even if the underlying trauma occurred in distant Bahamas waters. The dinghy, that crucial psychological escape vehicle, must be surrendered to investigators. The revealing video from the Abaco Inn must reach federal agents immediately for deep behavioral analysis. The psychosocial and physical search across Lubbers Quarters, Tahiti Beach, Snapper Point Marina, and the Hopetown mangroves must continue. You and I must stay completely objective here. Brian Hooker hasn't been charged, and his lawyers maintain his innocence. And yet Lynette Hooker has now been missing for 38 days. Her daughter endured her birthday and Mother's Day trapped in ambiguous grief, lacking answers, agonizing over the dead silence of the last man who saw her alive. She was 55. She freely chose an ocean lifestyle fully guided by her own deep-seated desires. She documented her reality compulsively: storms, sunsets, turtles, hard passages. It was her way of psychologically validating the intense life she believed in so passionately. Her final post revealed her exact state of mind. She wrote she wasn't going anywhere. Today, her boat is a dark crime scene. The top experts in deciphering the criminal mind are analyzing it right now. They dissect the trauma piece by piece, bag by bag. Every result, every court document, and every behavioral pattern this investigation makes public will be evaluated with that same clinical rigor. If anyone is holding back memories about this case, regarding the night of April 4th, the crew present during the passage, or those specific search zones in the Abacus authorities, have official secure channels to receive that information completely anonymously. Any behavioral clue, no matter how small it seems, could completely alter the psychological trajectory of this probe. If our clinical analysis brought you clarity today, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss future updates. Ring the bell to receive every new chapter of this psychological profile the moment it drops. Lynette Hooker has been missing for 38 days. The behavioral analysis continues. We will unpack more next session.